Shalom, everybody. It's Gav. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the UN, and I'm also going to do a brief review of the new movie 7 Days at Entebbe, and I'm going to tie the both together. Big news this week: the United States is withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council, which is great. That's another solid move, foreign policy-wise, on the Trump presidency. Note that I said foreign policy-wise. This is not a full-fledged endorsement of everything the man does, especially in light of certain events. Where's I going with this? Yes, the UN Human Rights Council is an absolute cesspool. There's no point in certain countries such as the U.S. and Britain being part of basically a panel organization with groups like the Congo, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, China, Algeria, I think is another one, Egypt. Yeah, it's an absolute joke. I mean, if we have through the UN Human Rights Council this move to push Saudi Arabia to be the head of women's rights at the UN. Hashtag not the onion. So yeah, that's a good move. That's a good, solid move. I don't have a whole lot of hope that the UN Human Rights Council is going to be reformed by this move. I know Britain's foreign secretary is saying that they're going to give it 6 months to clean up its act, and then ostensibly they'll do something too, possibly withdraw. I have no idea. But I don't have a whole lot of hope that it's going to change a whole lot because, well, let's face it, the UN Human Rights Council is a replacement organization. Before 2006, it was called the UN Commission on Human Rights, and it was scrapped and shut down for the exact same reasons that Ambassador Nikki Haley cited: its obsessive focus on Israel and the fact that its member states are made up of some of the worst human rights abusers in the world. I could go on forever about this, but I'm just going to leave it at that. I think the UN as a whole is an incredibly corrupt and basically worthless organization and institution. We kind of jokingly call the UN the unwanted nobodies here where I live. Kind of impotent, but yet they think they run the world, and they do it in a particularly unfair and unjudicious way. I'm going to tie that into my broader point this morning. There's been some controversy over a new film called 7 Days at Entebbe, which is, I'm sure many of you know, is about the incident in Entebbe, Uganda in 1976. Okay, so Reader's Digest version. The PFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a terrorist organization, hijacked an Air France flight out of Athens. There were 5 Palestinian hijackers, and there were actually 2 German hijackers, German hard leftists. One of them was named Wilfried Bose, and I can't remember the other one's name, the woman. They hijacked an Air France flight. It was first diverted to Benghazi, Libya, where it was refueled, and then it was flown on to Kampala, Uganda, capital of Uganda, where they were welcomed by the regime of Idi Amin Dada, who was the dictator of Uganda at the time. After about a week or so, rather than negotiate with the terrorists for the release of the hostages and basically weaken its standing around the world, Israel decided to launch a very brilliant commando raid against the airport in Uganda and rescue the hostages, which they were very successful. They rescued 102 out of, I think, 106 hostages. 3 were killed in the fight in the shootout over to take over the airport, which is unfortunate and sad. And then I believe another elderly woman was taken from the airport earlier by Idi Amin's forces, and she was later murdered. Unfortunately, her name was Dora Bloch. And yeah, So we have the PFLP, a terrorist organization, hijacking an Air France flight full of Israelis and Jews, being welcomed and sheltered by a dictatorial regime in Uganda. And we have Israel taking a very bold stance and action to save its own people after the terrorists had made it clear that they would be killed if the deadline expired for negotiations or if anything was attempted. The UN Secretary General at the time did not issue a statement or support a resolution condemning the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine for its hijacking of an Air France flight. It did not condemn this hijacking, which led to the death of 4 innocent people and 1 Israeli soldier, Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he was the older brother of current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The UN and the Secretary General at the time did not issue any condemnation towards Idi Amin Dada or the dictatorial regime in Uganda for sheltering the terrorists and for facilitating this absolutely farcical idea of negotiations, or for murdering Dora Bloch, which they did later. No, the UN and its Secretary General at the time sought to condemn Israel for violating Uganda's airspace and launching a hostage rescue raid in Uganda. Can you think of how morally depraved your mind has to be to work that way? A group of people responding to aggression and the potential murder of their own citizens is worse than the dictator and the hijackers that kicked off the whole thing in the first place. Of course, when we do a little bit of background, this is 1 year after the UN passed its famous Zionism equals racism resolution, which has since been repealed, and most of the countries who voted for it have since apologized. So yeah, that shouldn't be too surprising when we go a little bit deeper. There was an attempted resolution sponsored by Benin and a couple other countries of the African Union to try and pass a resolution condemning Israel for the hostage rescue raid. It failed, thankfully, but so did the counter resolution spearheaded by the United States and a couple other countries to condemn Idi Amin and the PFLP. That also failed. The UN in those days was led by the Secretary General. The head guy at the UN was a man named Kurt Waldheim. When we go a little bit into his background, which not many people know about, and it is not taught widely today, it becomes pretty clear why the UN was such a festering pile of Jew hate even in the 1970s, even back then. I'm going to read you a segment from a book called Nations United by Alex Grobman. The book takes a critical look of the UN's treatment of Israel. If you can get your hands on a copy, I highly recommend it. And yeah, it has a little bit of a segment on Kurt Waldheim and who he was. Spoiler alert, Kurt Waldheim was a Nazi. Those of you who know me know that I don't take that term lightly. I'm not one of these people that flippantly uses the term Nazi. I take a very, very kind of conservative approach to the use of the term. I don't really consider modern day neo-Nazis to be much of a very big threat, to be honest with you. They're small, they're undisciplined, they're very disorganized. Kurt Waldheim was an actual Nazi. And I'm going to read these couple paragraphs and you're going to see what I mean. Zionism equals racism and other anti-Israeli resolutions were adopted during the 2 terms Kurt Waldheim served as Secretary General of the UN from 1972 to 1981. His tenure was marked by antagonism towards Israel and Jewish concerns. When he made a visit to Yad Vashem, Israel's National Holocaust Museum, he did not cover his head during a memorial for the 6 million, the only dignitary to that point who had refused to do so. Waldheim allowed Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, to address the UN. When Zionism equals racism came up for a vote, Waldheim assumed a passive role. In July 1976, he was the only leader in the free world to declare that Israel's daring rescue of 105 hijacked Jewish and Israeli hostages being held by terrorists at the Entebbe airport was a contravention of Uganda's territorial sovereignty. Throughout his UN tenure, Waldheim successfully hid the fact that he had been a member of the Studentenbund, the Nazi student organization in Austria, and the Reitersturm, the Nazi Party's mounted unit of the Sturmabteilung assault unit, or brown-shirted paramilitary stormtroopers. During 1942 and 1943, Waldheim was an intelligence officer on the staff of General Alexander Lehr, the supreme commander of Wehrmacht forces in the Balkans, during brutal military campaigns against Yugoslav partisans and deportations of more than 70,000 Greek Jews to Auschwitz. Many of his superior officers were convicted of war crimes. In April of 1987, when he was president of Austria, the U.S. Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations added Waldheim's name to the list of people prohibited from entering the United States because he was morally complicit and assisted or otherwise participated in the persecution of persons because of race, religion, national origin, or political opinion. They noted that the intelligence reports he prepared were used by the German military to identify targets for extermination. I could go into deeper detail, but not only was Kurt Waldheim an actual card-carrying member of the German Nazi Party, he was a German military official that assisted in the hunting down and deportation of Jews and Yugoslav partisans to death camps. Do I really need to say anything more? And there are other resolutions that were passed during his tenure at the UN from 1972 to 1981 that are still considered respectable, that are still considered legitimate. Okay? The UN has not changed so much. The UN is still a festering pile of dog shit that it was back then. We need to pay way less attention to it and give it way less credence than it deserves. It has absolutely no moral standing. When you were once led by a Nazi, and that you hush about that nowadays. I mean, I've been to the UN headquarters in New York, and there's a brief exhibit where you can kind of look at the history of the UN. Funny how they never mention how they were once led by a closet Nazi for almost a decade. Funny how they never acknowledge that fact, or they acknowledge the extreme bias the organization took under the leadership of a Nazi. Obviously, duh. Something to think about. Now, for us to review the movie 7 Days in Entebbe. So, as a historian by academic training, I tend to like movies that are based on actual events, insofar as they tend to be accurate. Spoiler alerts. I recommend everybody see the movie and judge for yourselves, but don't come at me with, hey, why did you spoil that? Or why did you tell me that? Okay, spoiler alert. I'm going to reveal things about the plot and the outcome and things that are said and done in the movie that might ruin the experience for you if you haven't already seen it. So just be forewarned. So I thought it was kind of cool to see the events on the screen, which is kind of cool. Always. I did not like the political skew that was kind of introduced in the dialogue. I think the intentions of the director, I believe he's Brazilian. His name is Jose Padilha. Padilha. I'm not sure how to pronounce that exactly. I think he's probably well intentioned, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's pretty obvious from the get go that he takes a stance that the whole cycle of violence narrative, and that both sides are bad or have good points and bad points, and that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, that kind of crap. Um, he spends an inordinate amount of time through the dialogue of some of the characters lamenting the fact that there's no peace between Israel and what he calls Palestine. He treats Palestine as if it was or ever at any point was an actual country, which is factually problematic. In fact, it ends the movie. The subtitles come on. There are no negotiations between Israel and Palestine to this day, which, apart from being factually problematic, is entirely tangential to the subject of the movie. Palestinian terrorists, assisted by German terrorists, hijacked a plane full of Jews and threatened to kill them if And what he does, and he's admitted to this in several interviews he's given, is he tries to humanize the terrorists and kind of tell their side of the story. I'm sorry. At no point can you morally compare the people who take hostages and hijack airplanes and the people that free those hostages. There's no way. There's no other way in which this paradigm works. Why would it work in the case of Entebbe? Try and sell that idea on another subject for a movie. Let's make a movie. God forbid. I am not suggesting, I'm being facetious here. I am not suggesting anyone actually do this. It would be morally reprehensible and disgusting, just like it is here. But let's say some aspiring director wants to make a movie about Emmett Till, the murder of Emmett Till, but he tells it, quote unquote, even handedly, not exclusively from the eyes of the victim, Emmett Till, but from his abductors and his murderers. If it tries to humanize, well, they were complicated people. It was a complicated situation. No, it wasn't. Some motherfuckers kidnapped a kid and they murdered him over a false accusation. Okay? Similarly, some motherfuckers hijacked an airplane and we saved them. I think the most cringeworthy piece of dialogue in the movie is one of the German terrorists, played by Daniel Bruhl, the real terrorist's name was Wilfred Bose, is talking to one of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine terrorists, in the terminal at Entebbe, and the Palestinian terrorist makes a remark along, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly what he said. It's been a couple of days since I've seen the movie. And he says something along the lines of, "You Germans feel so guilty about what you did to the Jews that you projected onto us. We're also the victims of what the Germans did to the Jews because we, quote unquote, we lost our country and, we're being treated the same way now." So that's the most cringeworthy part, where Palestinians claim that they're treated just as bad as Jews were treated under the Nazis. That's pretty cringeworthy. There's no excuse for putting that little bit in there. Forget the fact that it's completely, entirely factually void. That's clearly taking a side in what is supposed to be an even-handed account. And towards the end, it shows Wilfred Bose is kind of shown as being constantly in struggle with his role as a hijacker and someone guarding a bunch of innocent people. And there is some evidence from eyewitness accounts of hostages that survived that may have been the case. He was tasked with killing the hostages if there was any attempted rescue. And according to some eyewitness accounts, he froze when he was supposed to kill the hostages, and he told them all to get on the ground. And that may be true. His refusing to kill hostages after he put them in that situation and after he hijacked an airliner does not make him innocent. It does not make him good. Okay? At best, I think it makes Wilfred Bowes a coward who failed to live up to his own convictions in the last few seconds of his life. It's much more accurate about the portrayal of his partner, the female German terrorist, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head right now. Eyewitness testimony has her verbally abusing hostages and making anti Semitic slurs, which is not shown during the movie, interestingly enough. She's confused as kind of like this. She's portrayed as this kind of morally confused woman who really doesn't want to be there, and probably isn't really that bad. Had she had some guidance, that type of thing. So those are my big complaints about it. Don't humanize terrorists. Don't humanize human rights violators. Don't apologize for them. Don't try and put their case before the screen as if anything they've experienced justifies anything they do, because it doesn't. I will say that Israel does get some positive mention in the film as well, but I don't think anything that outdoes the damage done by the constant humanization of the terrorists. I mean, he was prime minister at the time. He's played by Lior Ashkenazi, a very famous Israeli actor. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin is shown as being very dovish and not wanting to antagonize the Palestinians or do anything further. Shimon Peres is also shown as the Minister of Defense is shown as being a little bit more hawkish, which is kind of odd. If anybody ever knew anything about the man, he wasn't really hawkish at all. But they're shown as basically struggling with this idea of what to do about the situation. And the rescue scene, again, spoiler alert, was kind of frustrating for me because it was all in slow mo. And it was also shared with a dance scene. I know it sounds weird, but every few frames it transitions to a dance troupe on stage, and one of the soldiers that's participating in the raid, his girlfriend is a dancer. So you have this kind of odd, very violent thing happening, a hostage rescue being constantly contradistinct. That's probably not the word, and that's also probably terrible English. Against a dance act, which I thought was really weird and kind of took away from the whole thing. But yeah. So, and in the end, the final credits, there's some text where it's like, okay, one Israeli soldier was killed and 4 Israeli hostages ultimately died. And then it lists, and then it talks about the PFLP and the German terrorists as if these are equals, as if hostages and soldiers trying to save them are equal with the hijackers and the terrorists that kept them, that were attempting to kill them at one point. So that was particularly disgusting. I honestly don't think there was any malicious intent on the part of the film's makers. I think their intentions were good. But the problem with trying to be even-handed when you're making an account of a historical event is that you're bound to devolve into moral relativism, where these people do this, these people do that, they're both kind of equally bad with some good points. No, that's not how it works. I'm sorry. There is no excuse for hijacking an airplane. There never has been, there currently isn't, and there never will be. Much less threatening to kill the people on the airplane that you hijack. And so, that was basically what I wanted to talk about this morning, and I got all that out. I suggest people see the movie for themselves and make their own judgment. Don't rely on my opinion. But that's all I had to say. Questions, comments, leave them in the comment section. Take care. Bye bye.